We're going to start with the text code name MMT. At least that's the code that's been going around for the last 20 years for this text. And I want to talk a little about it first, how it came to be, how it got into our hands before we really get into it. So the title of the text is Miqsat Maase HaTorah. Can you say that with me? Miqsat Maase HaTorah. It means, you can probably get what it means. Some of the works of the Torah, or some of the works of the law. And that comes from a quote in the second letter. It's a two-letter set. The translation I'm using, using for the reconstruction, is really the first one that came out. It was done by Eisenman and Wise, and they actually took the fragments of several texts and pieced them together to get it this way. If you read it in your Dead Sea Scrolls now, it's not the same, because since then other people have got a hold of it and put it together differently. And I've noticed that in the translations we have now, the calendrical issues they've taken out. So here's how we got this, the best that I can recount. The story is pretty foggy. Nobody really knows exactly what happened, but it's worth mentioning. In the 60s, the head of the Scrolls, International Scrolls Committee, was a man named John Strugnell. He was a professor of Middle East Studies at Harvard. And what these scroll scholars were supposed to be doing was to piece these fragments together and translate them, and then make a translation available for the general public. All these scholars that were working on these texts were Catholics, with the exception of one. John Marco Allegro was not a Catholic, but he was an expert in Aramaic and other Middle Eastern languages. His story is also quite unique. Anyway, Strugnell had all these scraps of paper and texts and everything, and he began to piece them out to his students rather than to do them himself. And he pieced the fragments we're going to look at today out to a student named Elisha Qimron, Qimron. Elisha Qimron very quickly translated this text, but he never published it. And when there was a call to get it published, he decided to do something instead, that he would go and make presentations to small groups of scholars only, where he would pass out a sheet with the Hebrew and the translation on it, I should say Aramaic, pass them out. Each one of these sheets was numbered. And then at the end of the lecture, he would collect the sheets again, make sure that everyone was there, and during the course of the lecture, nobody could leave. So he was protecting this for himself and, I would say, for his money-making ability in the future. So various reports of how long, but I think that he translated it in 56. And we're pushing up to 1990 now, when he's still holding this back. Well, obviously, he reckoned it as righteousness, to use a Qumran term. He reckoned it as righteousness to hold it back for himself as long as he possibly could. One of these presentations that he did, and I'm going to say in the late 80s, maybe even 90, he used his usual method, passing out the sheets and then collecting them again and not allowing anyone to leave the room. There was a Polish scholar there of Qumran studies. I can't remember his name. But somehow he was able to transcribe the Aramaic or Hebrew and the translation onto toilet paper and napkins. And so when he passed his sheet back in, he had this stuff in his pocket. And I'm surprised the Qumran didn't just have everyone searched on the way out. So this little Polish guy, he ran a newsletter in Poland for people that spoke Polish about Qumran studies. And he had about 35 people on his mailing list. This was, of course, before the Iron Curtain came down. And so he had very limited audience for what he was doing. And because, as you pointed out last night, Mark, the technology wasn't so hot in Poland at that time, so he used a mimeograph machine to do this. Put a staple in it, send it out. He published in his little newsletter Qumran's transcription and interpretation, sent it out to his 35 people on his mailing list, and somehow one of them ended up on the desk of Herschel Shanks, the editor of Biblical Archaeology Review. And I've been subscribed to that for years and years, and I was subscribing at that time and watching all what was going on. So Shanks wrote in his magazine that we don't have permission to do this, but it's such a big deal that we're going to take our chances. At about the same time, let's see, here it is. This book here was being written and started the publishing process. So Eisenman got one of these too from someplace. And he and Wise wrote that book. Wise, you know, is the one that has translated the rest of the scrolls, and his translation is just as good as anybody else's right there. Better. Better. If you use a translation, if you're using Gaze of Vermesh translation, throw it in the trash. It is that an updated version? Yes, it's an updated version. So they went ahead and published, and Qumran sued them all in Israeli court. Qumran was and still is a professor of Mideast languages in the Sinai branch of, what's the big university in Jerusalem? Not Holy Land, but, huh? No, it's a name of a university I'm looking for. No. I don't know if there's a substitute. Yeah, it's the same thing. Yeah. Oh, yeah? Okay. You think you can handle that? We'll see. And for the recording, Commander Lee and Mark Heston are going to get a chair that one can sit on without having to listen to it jumping around and squeaking. Last night I was in bunk back there. I mean, you couldn't move your toe without it squeaking. Honestly, I laid in there, and I moved my little toe, and it. So I had to change in the middle of the night. It was driving me crazy. But look at this. That's almost like a throne. Not that kind of throne.
Well, we don't have one in the area. Only 15.
And you might notice today I'm wearing a katan with tassels and linen pants. The linen pants come from Professor Smith, and the katan comes from Mrs. Anne Lel Kende. Thank you. Thank you. You guys are heating it. Yeah, that's good.
You want a high chair or another cushion on that? Or
Nah, it's okay. It's okay. All right.
might be a little squishy. Actually, this is a little firmer than that one.
Very good. That's why they call him the detox whisperer. All right, back to the lawsuit. Well, I believe there were two trials. One trial was suing Eisenman and Wise, and the other was suing Herschel Shanks of the magazine. And the trial went on, and they called it the trial of the century for biblical studies at that time. And sure enough, Qumran won the one against Herschel Shanks. Hold on a second. And in the magazine, as the months went on, he was soliciting a legal fund. There was a cap in Israel on this kind of theft. And the cap, I believe, was $100,000. That's all you could win. And of course, Qumran won it. Barr paid it. As for the trial against Eisenman and Wise, Wise was just a very young scholar at that time. He had a lot to lose. So Wise groveled at the feet of Qumran and his crown, groveled, apologizing, crying and everything. And on the other hand, Robert Eisenman, he said, why don't you all go to hell? Yeah. So I think Robert last time, he talked a little about this last time he was on, did he? Yeah, I thought he had. And I think he had to settle. This is one of the things I asked him to talk a little about, if we can get him up tomorrow. Because this is the thing that broke up the team of Eisenman and Wise. So Wise went his own way, and you notice in Wise's introduction to the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's a fine introduction, but he has to pay his dues to the consensus. That is, that Qumran was a monastery, and there were a bunch of peaceful monks there, and they were spending day in and day out copying texts. They were just like the scroll scholars, all monks, just like the Desert Fathers, just like living in the cell in the monastery. They were just like that. My connection's unstable. But anyway, that's how this came to be. So we have in the Uncovered book, Dead Sea Scrolls Uncovered, a brand new translation. Of course, this is, I think, back to 92, I think. But the translation is very good. And what you find in Wise's translation here is missing a lot. So I used the translation from Uncovered, and I filled it in a little bit. And that's what we're going to find here. Now, one of the things that has been said about these Qumranites, or Essenes in general, is that not only were they broken off of the establishment religious culture in Israel, not only that, but living in communities with just Essenes in some particular places. They were so concerned with the issue of the commands of Elohim and so wanted to get it right that there was of necessity quibbling between various groups, and even within the sect here we're going to read about that had to do with this letter, wrote this letter, received this letter, whatever. One of the things that holiness seems to bring on us is our desire to get it right. Take a Torah, for instance. Torah talks about reckoning works as righteousness. Remember that from Abraham. Paul and James, who we'll look at a little later, you both use these terms in diametrically opposite ways. But in order to follow the Torah, there were a lot of questions that needed to be answered. On the way up here, we were talking about one particular thing, and somebody said, well, what about those people that say, prove it to me in the Torah? I don't know if you've ever had anybody say that. You put forth an idea, prove it to me in the Torah. Well, the Torah doesn't tell you much. It tells a lot about Levitical sacrifices and some moral things. But one of the issues I brought up in Think Tank yesterday was, where is female homosexuality prohibited in the Torah? Some people went nuts over that because it's not. It's not. So whether we think it's a sin or not, or think it's the same thing as men's homosexuality, makes no difference. But those that want to make it, to extend or to explain or to interpret Torah commands, they have of necessity to reinterpret and to add to the Torah, in some cases to take away. One of the things that Dead Sea Scrolls Uncovered makes it clear that the Torah was messed with by Nazarenes. It was greatly enhanced, well, actually diminished by their taking out of things. And they point out in that book that, as Josephus said at this time, the Pharisees in the first century were in charge of everything, including the temple. You remember there was a coup in first century BC. Allison's going to talk about more of this at a later time when we're going to do some history. But there was a coup, and the Pharisees took over the entire government. And it was that way from, I think it was 30 BC, right on up through the entire first century. And that was the only real sect that came out of Judaism to survive the Roman wars. That was it, because they collaborated. They were foreigners in the first place, and they took over the government, and they collaborated with Rome in order to set up the future for Judaism. We see something in the Epistle of Barnabas very similar, because we've got Barnabas coming to the fore after the fall of Jerusalem. And his intention, as he puts out in his first chapter, is to bring the remnants together and reunite them as though they were children reuniting with the parent. Barnabas speaking of himself as the parent. So there was generally, when that was all over, they tried hard to reinstitute some type of religious faith there. So many people were killed. So many went out into exile that, well, we could talk about this forever, except to say that there are some remnants like the Epistle of Barnabas and like the MMT that shows us succinctly what types of changes or additions needed to be made to the Torah to bring people back to the Torah. The translation of the first letter, we don't know who these letters were sent to or who sent them. Don't know. I have some theories on that. I'm not so sure that they were sent by the Qumranites, but rather received. But these letters tell us this is why we separated out from them. Here again, over an issue of dogs in the camp. That was the primary issue here, and the purity regulations that they understood to be absolutely necessary to continue to do sacrifices. And I got to tell you that if somebody says to you that the Essenes are all vegans, that's insane. Just reading the text, I have no doubt that there were sects of Essenes that were vegans and vegetarians. But to say that they all are just is not the case. Even in this letter, you'll find that that's disproved. One thing I really like about this translation is it starts with calendrical issue, something that we argue about all the time. And, about a year and a half ago, we were really in deep with calendar issues in the Yahad and bringing people together. And you might remember the calendar girls. Yeah, okay. We'll go over a little of this calendar, maybe the whole thing, because we're going to have another couple calendar presentations from Mark coming up later. We'll just kind of put a foundation on it. Month 1, in the first month, on the 4th of it, is a Shabbat. This tells you what day the first month started on by going back. We know that the Shabbat was what we call Saturday for them and for us. Going back 4 days takes us back to Wednesday. And you know why and all that. I don't want to go into that. And then on the 14th of it is a Passover. 18th of it's a Sabbath. 25th is a Sabbath. Afterward, the 26th of it is the waving of the Omer. I don't see anything referring to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. You know that the Passover and that feast are two separate festivals. They're often confused and put together because they're right together. Did they have unleavened bread? Did they do that feast? That would be a good project for somebody. On the second of the second month, on that day is a Sabbath. On the 9th is a Sabbath. On the 14th, obviously we can see that we are going in succession of sevens. It is the second Passover. That'd be the 14th of the second month. Now, can anybody explain what the second Passover is all about?
Or been on a journey, then you would pass over the second month.
So if you miss the first Passover, you could do it then the next month. Okay.
In a way, that was kind of a celebration of the manna.
Of what?
Maybe we'll get into that, but in a way, that was the celebration of the manna. Anyway.
Okay. You might consider one thing that is interesting to note as you say that. Were these people in the dispersion from Egypt? Probably not. They probably never left Egypt at that time, might have known nothing about manna in the wilderness. And that's one of the goods of the Black Holes book. Black holes in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we've got feather that demolishes the idea that the New Jerusalem is even in Jerusalem, or any of this stuff is in Israel at all, or the copper scroll treasures are in Israel. They're in Egypt. The connection, he makes so many connections in that book and his two previous books with Egypt that it's hard for me even to believe that these people knew anything about Moses, or perhaps Moses was a later addition. I wonder if you could if you got a phone or something and are not using it, can you put it in airplane mode? Because my bandwidth is very shallow right now. So there's no unleavened. Third month, we have what they call the Festival of Weeks and the Sabbaths. After first day and second day, an extra third day is added at the end of this month. Now, what's that all about? Do you remember? Remember, there were 360-day year with 4 intercalary days. And at the end of every quarter, they put one of the intercalary days in, as described in the book of Enoch. All right. Another thing that's important about this piece of text is we get these other festivals and exactly when they're to be. Like here we have in month 5, Festival of New Wine. Oh, they should have had a festival of old wine too, because the old is better. And going down month 6, the Festival of New Oil. And right after that, the offering of wood. And after the 6th month, again, we have that intercalary day. Yes, ma'am. No. Just go ahead. Speak up, though.
Month 3, okay, so that would be the end of the quarter of the year when the extra day is added.
Mm-hmm.
But it says after the first day and second day, an extra third day is added. So it's not added at the end of the month.
Well, let me take a look here. Is that after month 3?
Yes.
All right. If you look at the phrase just before that, on the 28th of it is a Sabbath. Then after a first day and second day, an extra third day is added. So there's,
the first day would be the 29th, second day would be the 30th, and then the extra.
yeah,
Okay.
exactly. I was thinking about these festivals, new wine, new oil, wood. I think there's one more. Were these perhaps for the priest? Because, for instance, a new wine festival, we're told other places that the priest gets a tithe of the wine, a tithe of the oil. And in one place in here, it talks about instead of the first tenth, the fourth tenth. Yeah, we'll get to that and we'll see what that's all about. They have on the month 7 something called the Day of Remembrance. I'm figuring that's Teruah, Yom Teruah. The 10th is the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. And then the Festival of Booths. Then they have something called the Gathering. I'm just guessing that that's what we call the Great Day. The 8th day after the beginning of Tabernacles.
Wasn't that when they began the Torah anew?
That's Simchat, yeah. Okay, let's see. Month 12, where's Hanukkah?
They don't celebrate Hanukkah.
Why is that, you think?
Was this before the event?
Well, no, but Allison's going to tell us why in her history. Because you got to know the history a little bit, and you got to know that the Maccabees turned on the Hasidim. In the books of the Maccabees, the Hasidim are the Essenes. So yes, there is mention of those in the intertestamental books, and the Maccabees and Pharisees and the usurping priests turned on them and executed a bunch of them. And that is, well, according to Rachael Elior, that is what caused the exile to start, of the priests going to the east and to the west, going into the wilderness as far as going east. And of course, her understanding is that they took the holy books out of the temple because those books were their books. And they took them out and hid them in these caves. At the time, they felt from a prophetic word that the day of Yahweh was coming, and they actually put a date on that, which could very well correspond exactly to the Olivet Discourse, the part where it says this generation will see it all. A biblical generation's 40 years, and in the scrolls, the prophecy is for 40 years, laying right out. All right, so that's the calendar part of it. And there we have it. Now, I looked and looked and looked for this in Wise's Dead Sea Scrolls. I couldn't find it any place. I don't know what happened to it, this calendar part. But here we have it in this particular rendition with different fragments put together in this way. Now we'll look at sectarianism, and that's with the legal issues. The text says, these are some of our words concerning the law of Elohim, that is, some of the works that reckon as justifying you. All of them have to do with holy gifts and purity issues. Again, we find this phrase reckoned as righteousness or reckoned as justification all throughout this corpus of literature. I don't know if it's meant in the same sense that we do today, but in the church, justification is a very important theological word and explains, to some extent, part of the history of salvation. Justifying is to make one adjudicated as innocent or forgiven in this life. Doesn't have much to do in here with ultimate salvation, but rather what it takes to live the kind of life that's expected by Torah, and especially their additions to Torah, which we see coming up right here. But we'll preface this next section by understanding that one of the hot items at this time was disputed and fought about. Even foreign powers were in on this, was their moratorium on doing sacrifices on behalf of or by Gentiles. Remember, they had a king, probably Agrippa, first at this time. I believe this is the first century document, written sometime around 40. The second letter appears to be written to King Agrippa, who was purportedly and described himself as a Torah keeper. Remember the story in Josephus, how there was a head of an assembly in Jerusalem named Shimon. And Shimon's business was to constantly prod Agrippa the First, who died in 44, I might add, to keep the Torah more honestly and in a valid manner rather than the way he was keeping it, which, of course, he was a king. He brought foreign dignitaries over, and he would entertain them from different lands. You might remember in that story that Agrippa built a porch on top of his palace that could see over the wall and into the camp of the temple, and could actually view the sacrificing on a daily basis. And he would bring Gentiles up there to sit around and eat and drink and be entertained by the sacrificing of animals. So the zealots, probably these very ones here, zealots from Qumran, zealot Essenes, Messianics, Jewish Christians, and those people that Acts 21 call zealous for the Torah, they begin to build a wall that would block Agrippa's view. And they got quite a ways on that before he stopped it. But the Shimon that was the head of the assembly was called into Agrippa. Probably you would think that he's going to be executed. But Agrippa calls him in to show him what kind of Torah keeper he is, and to explain to him that as a king, he had to entertain these Gentiles. He didn't especially want to. But again, at this time, the temple authorities, under the influence of zealots, had cut off any kind of sacrificing by Gentiles or for them. See, they had sacrificed daily for the emperor, for instance, and they quit that. This is important to the emperor Nero, for instance, that they continue sacrificing for him because he was superstitious about such things. And he thought, well, the God of the Jews is going to preserve me if the rest of them don't, until the temple sacrifice stopped for him. Then they took all the vessels, even the gold stuff, out of the treasury and got rid of it. That was given by foreign dignitaries that would stop in, leave their offering there. And then finally, we see the notices going up on stone placards prohibiting with the penalty of death, anybody going past certain areas inside even the court of the nations. And finally, even the court of the nations that was open to anybody that wanted to come was closed off entirely to Gentiles. This was part and parcel of what was called the priesthood of Phineas or Pincus. Zealots called themselves part of the priesthood of Phineas because you remember what Phineas did, that he was told, you will always have a man standing before me. Somebody in your family will always stand for me because you killed this priest and his foreign wife. Remember, he had taken a spear and he'd gone through both of them. And so they were getting back to this kind of xenophobic thinking and barring everyone. It was causing all kinds of trouble. Where am I going to? Oh yeah, finally back to Shimon. So Shimon spends a day with Agrippa I in his palace. He doesn't get executed. He gets explanations, and he gets to watch Agrippa's life during the day. And of course, when Agrippa sends him back, Josephus tells us he's sent back with valuable gifts for his assembly. Now, I'm just wondering, considering we're talking about the early 40s, who's this Shimon that had an assembly in Jerusalem? Will this be the same guy we call Kepha? I certainly think so. And even Luke uses that story and changes it around some to come up with, I think it's Acts chapter 10, the story of the kind centurion, Cornelius. Because even the name of the general in Josephus' story is Cornelius. Got the same names of people in there. The situation's just turned around a little. So we can understand why one is not to eat any Gentile grain, nor is it permissible to bring it to the temple. So that's the end of any kind of stuff coming in from foreign areas. No grain. If they get their way. If they get their way. And this was the trend at that time. Concerning the sin offering that is boiled in vessels of Gentile copper, did they boil the sin offering? Well, there's that one verse in Deuteronomy 16 that says they boiled it. And most of these, most translations change that and say they roasted it. But we did an intensive word study online. And if Allison was here, she would tell you the actual word. And it does say boiled, and it does say boiled in reference to the Passover. So we might wonder, what is in the world is boiled here? But even the hard metal was thought to be impure. Gentile copper. Copper was like the lingua franca of metals at that time. Copper was considered very much like the sun, the brightest of the metals. You can make mirrors out of it. It was the most pliable. Besides, didn't we all make these copper art pieces when we were in middle school? You remember with the little hammer tapping the copper? Okay. Further, they boil in the courtyard of the temple and thereby pollute it with the soup they make. In their manner of thinking, Jerusalem, the whole city within the walls, was the camp, and the temple was the tabernacle. In the rest of Judaism's thinking at that time, the temple itself, the camp would have been the court of the nations. Because, see, we've got a bunch of animals in there. Filthy animals by the door of the court of the nations that Yeshua got out of there with his whip of cords. And the temple itself was the three holy places in there. So we have an entire city being looked at as the camp. And of course, where this is going is to a new Jerusalem, where we'll find out in a later text is not Jerusalem at all. See, how's my time? I think I've got to launch. Concerning, he says, as far as the boiling and these other things in the soup they make, that sounds pretty good, though, actually. We disagree with these practices. We disagree with these practices. Concerning sacrifices by Gentiles, we say that in reality, they sacrifice to the idol that seduces them, and therefore it is illicit. So that gives you the whole reason right there. They're not sacrificing, in their view, to the Elohim of Israel, but they're sacrificing to whatever God that they would normally worship. Further, regarding the thank offering that accompanies peace offerings that they put aside on one day for the next, just stop there for a minute. One redaction of the Lord's Prayer, probably the earliest one, says, "Give us this day our bread for the morrow." Give us this day our bread for the morrow. That is probably the most accurate and one that's been changed. Hiya, Rich.
Hey, how are you, sir?
Good. Good to see you on. We're doing the MMT. If you want to join and get a copy of what I'm going through, if you're interested, I'll send you a link.
Okay.
You want it?
Sure.
All right, let me get it for you. It's coming by chat. How you been?
I've been good. How are you?
Good now. Try that out. That's a PDF file, by the way.
Okay.
It's lengthy. Okay.
Yeah, I got it.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah.
Is the connection, does it seem stable over there?
Yeah. The video is a little jumpy at times, but it's not bad.
Yeah.
It's not
Okay.
bad. It comes through.
Yeah, we got limited internet here. We're on the deserted island called Panditaria.
I thought you were going to say Patmos.
Well, it's not too far. from there. Now look at this next section about the thank offering. Putting it aside on one day for the next. I think this directly reflects in the Lord's Prayer. Lord's Prayer.
Do you think there's an earlier version than that which Salve discovered?
Who?
Salve, that ancient echoes, they have.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think there's an earlier one than that?
Well, I should say that the consensus translators and scholars do. I have a scholar's version of the Gospels and a new translation by the Jesus Seminar. The Jesus Seminar? You ever heard of that?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, the Jesus Seminar, probably half of them are unbelievers, but they're trying to determine over the last 10 years what he actually said and what he didn't. And they have to start this with clean and the earliest translation they can get of what they've got. You know, they just don't pick up an NIV and go through it. And, well, they vote on the different things, actually. They vote. So we reckon that the grain offering, reckon again, is to be eaten with the fat and the flesh on the day that they are offered. Question arises, was it just the priests that ate meat? Remember, these guys aren't sacrificing anything. They're not in control of the temple, but they're very interested in what's going on there because they consider the temple entirely polluted, as well as the city. And it was their intention, in one way or the other, to get rid of the people that were in there, not to burn the temple down or burn the city down, but to restore it and do kind of like the Maccabees did, rededicate the place to a higher purpose. So here they're eating the fat and the flesh. There would be so much fat and so much flesh. The priests could never eat all that. And the priests suffered from being overweight and gout and heart disease and everything else because they had so much meat in their diet. But what I reckon is that this meat was given out freely to anybody that wanted it. It was already cooked. It's very hard to believe that Essenes such as these were vegetarians or vegans. And, you know, if people tell me that, they need to go look at these texts.
Right.
Now we get to the red heifer. With regard to the purity of the heifer that purifies from sin, that is the red heifer. This is big in Pentecostal circles, in charismatic groups, where they're going to find the red heifer. Oh, we found one in Texas. Then they found one gray hair. It's incumbent upon priests to assure that care is taken in the matter, so the priest won't bring sin on the people. I jumped up there a little bit. He who slaughters the red heifer, and he who burns it, and he who gathers his ashes, and he who sprinkles the water of purification from sin, all these are to be pure with the setting of the sun, so that only the pure man will be sprinkling upon the impure. You're going to see this same theme going on through the rest of this MMT. It's going to be that the pure consecrates the pure, making the consecrated pure, and on down the line, even with inanimate objects like Gentile copper and things like that. Also, it says, with regard, regarding the skin and bones of unclean animals, for they are making from the bones and from the skin handles for vessels. One is not to bring them to the temple. They're unclean. With regard to the skin from the carcass of a clean animal, he who carries that carcass must not touch holy items susceptible to impurity, because impurity or the impure person is never going to be able to render purity, or is never going to be able to gain purity by touching something that's pure. It doesn't work that way. The conduit only flows one way, from pure.
Can I ask
Sure.
a question?
Sure.
So, and I can't remember, it might have been, I don't know if you've read the book Moses and the Original Torah. And he might have mentioned it in there. It's a fascinating book. But he mentions that there are certain things that are no doubt have pagan origins that come through in some of the stuff we have. And I think it's mentions that the red heifer is specifically one of the things that a lot of scholars don't even question. Was that originally in the Torah, or was that something that got brought in by paganism? And they think it absolutely was. I don't know if you'd heard anything about that, or your thoughts on that, or anything.
Anybody have a comment on that? Where did the red heifer come from, and other practices like that? Did they come in from paganism? It would depend on whether the red heifer was Jewish or not. Well, my take on this is yes, but these Qumranites that are dealing with these issues, they're doing it theoretically because they want to ferret out those things that did come in and get rid of them.
Right.
But then, what we understand, Rich, is that the Torah underwent a great deal of refurbishment during the 1st century, 2nd century BC, and that the original Torah was taken away by the Zadokite priests. You know about that, Raquel Elior's ideas.
I mean, I know about that idea. I don't know specifically of Raquel Elior.
Okay. And that afterwards, the Pharisees got a hold of the whole system, and the Masoretes after them rewrote everything. I think most of us have a consensus about that. And here's Liz McGee, that she's got a little input. You want to come up here? Because we can't hear you back there. Come on up. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm just looking up Raquel Elior. I've watched a seminar from her, or a talk from her before. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Liz is going to come up and address it.
I'm not quite sure where you're going with this, but where are you dating this text? Have you dated this yourself? When are you dating it?
40
Oh,
AD.
All right, now
Doesn't fit any place else.
well, can I just say my take would be, I think that they're spot on personally. I think that if I was in a scene and then we were there, we'd be doing this. These purity issues I absolutely can see where they're getting them and why they're fanatical. And I would say, I would bet my money if you were there in that day and you would be just like they are. And I don't think it's pagan at all, because I think that understanding what the sacrifice, what my understanding today is, the Gentile cannot have anything to do with this. Gentile grain, Gentile copper, Gentile, any of this stuff, and that the heifer would be totally non-pagan, but Azazel, the whole concept, these people had Enochian understandings going way back, right? Azazel. So and that's what I'm saying, because I didn't know where you dated. I don't know why you have to date it then. Can't you just have this free, you know?
It's
So that's
just
my
not my opinion, Bill. There is another possibility, and that is the middle of 1st century BC. But you see, we're looking at the internal evidence. And all we can do is say, look at it, look at history, and decide what fits, insofar as we know. That's all we can do.
Well, why would Peter, Peppa, right,
Mm-hmm.
be in this mode of understanding if the Cornelius vision had already happened to him at this point?
Because that's a made-up story. There's no truth to it whatsoever. It's
I wasn't in the room.
well, it's stolen out of Josephus, and his account of the Shimon going into King Agrippa's palace for the day. The same people's names are in there. Cornelius is in there. Agrippa's in there. We can look that up. I think this was one of the more exciting finds about Josephus and the Acts of the Apostles especially, because there are numerous different scenarios of Josephus that have been reworked and put into Acts. That's why we take the first 16 chapters of Acts with a tablespoon of salt. It is not the writer's intention, whoever wrote it, to teach you straight history. If you look at the way Acts is structured, he's taking us down the salvation road. He's unfolding piece by piece soteriology, or the soteriology of his group, the salvation history of his group. And this is something we could certainly go into more, because the way he lays it out is so precise. Well, I'll just give you one example. He has, wait a minute. He starts with, in the first chapter, he's got the family of Yahshua there and his close disciples in an upper room, isolated. Later on, it's an Ethiopian eunuch. Later on, it's some women. Next, it's Romans or Gentiles. Next, it's Ephesians. Get the Holy Spirit. Next, Samaritans. Even Philip goes to Samaria. Then there's the daughters of Philip. Was it four? 4 prophets. And then by the time we get to the end of it, we have Paul's journeys all over the place. It's spreading out. That's his whole intention there. And in each of his stories, he shows us how we can take that same road. It's like, again, Philip in Samaria. Yes, what name have you been baptized into? Well, they say, well, in the name of John. And he explains it further and baptizes them in the name of Yahshua. But he has to call apostles in to administer the baptism of the Holy Spirit at that time. Then by the time they get to Ephesus, you don't have to call the apostles in anymore, because this is spread now to more the inner disciples and more the people on the edges. It's falling on people now. And by the time you start in an isolated room and you end up all over the world. That's the teaching method of whoever Luke is, who I happen to think was what was Nero's secretary name? Epaphroditus. I think it can be nobody else but Epaphroditus that wrote that. You know, the church put Luke on there because the dates, of course, because Luke uses Josephus so extensively, we know when Josephus published his Antiquities. So Luke's book has to be in a finished state somewhere around then, 95, has to be. Or the coincidences are so coincidental as to be exponentially impossible. But he tells right at the beginning, "Oh, Theophilus, I tried to show you this other part. Now let me show you this." Yes, ma'am. Come on up here, can you? Okay. This is Sherry Gamble, a tremendous exegete. That's all right. Give me a chance to get up. Okay.
I'm close enough to here. Okay, so I did a study on the red heifer sacrifice several years ago. Somebody I had met online was writing.
Can she speak up a little bit?
So speak up, please.
Okay. So somebody that I've met online was writing about how they had gone into a hotel room once and there was somebody lying on the floor. He went to roll him over and he had actually been shot and he was dead. And he was a believer in Yeshua, a Messianic, but he was concerned about how the sacrifice of Christ for us would cover this. You know, he was familiar with the red heifer sacrifice and the prescription there for cleansing a person of touching a dead body, but you know, like how did that apply? And so I embarked on a study of the red heifer sacrifice to look at the different elements of the sacrifice and compare it to the elements of the crucifixion. And so I'm just going to go through it, through the different prescriptions of the law. So the statute of the law is that you have an unblemished red heifer, and you know, Yeshua was without sin, and so he qualified for that. And then you give it to Eleazar the priest, and he takes it outside the camp. Yeshua was brought outside of the camp. In, I believe, the scroll that you're working with right now, the MMT, at some point it says that
Yes.
Jerusalem is the camp.
Yeah, it's coming right up in
So,
the next paragraph.
So the temple is the temple, and then Jerusalem is the camp, and outside the camp is outside of that space. Well, he was brought outside the camp for the crucifixion, and it was the priests, chief priests, that were responsible for this whole affair. Well, then it says, Eleazar the priest shall take some of the blood with his finger and sprinkle it toward the front of the tent of meeting 7 times. And so I counted up the different places in Yeshua's body where he was actually punctured. He had 2 hands, 2 feet, that's 4. He had the head with the crown of thorns. The back was whipped, and then at last of all, the piercing of the side. And so there were 7 times that his body was pierced. Then the heifer is burned in sight. Then the priest shall take cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet material. Well, the cedar is the cross. The hyssop, the scarlet is the robe that he was presented to the people with. And then the hyssop at the end was the branch that the sponge was put on, lifted up to his mouth for the vinegar, whatever it was. Then the priest shall wash his clothes, bathe his body in water, and afterward come into the camp. But the priest is unclean till evening. And one of the priests, or what did I have him here? Nicodemus, it was a man of the Pharisees, and he is the first one that came and brought the spices. And I'm interpreting being unclean till evening really as a matter of faith. You know, at the point where they are cleansed through their belief in what is going on. Then a man who is clean shall gather up the ashes of the heifer and deposit them outside the camp in a clean place. And the one that gathers the ashes shall wash his clothes and be clean till evening. And so we had Joseph of Arimathea. He was disciple. So he was one who's already considered clean because he was already a disciple and had belief in him. And he gathered his body and he took it out and put it into a tomb that had never had a person laid in it. So that was into a clean place. And then it says, talks about the purification. Oh, I've skipped one, sorry. Somewhere in here, I lost my place. It talks about someone who is unclean. No, who someone that is the person who's overseeing the burning of the red heifer, that he would be clean in the evening, but it doesn't mention him going back to camp. The other ones, it talks about them going back to the camp, going back into Jerusalem. But then the one that oversaw the burning actually doesn't say anything about them going back into the camp, but that they're clean in the evening. And this is the centurion, I believe, who really isn't part of the community. He doesn't go back into the camp because he is not of them. But he does believe, you know, at the certain point, he says, you know, surely this is Son of God, and he goes on with that. So, and then later on, we end up in Hebrews, and it talks about the purification through the sprinkling of the blood and his sacrifice. So I don't believe that the statutes for the red heifer sacrifice are pagan origin. I think they are part of the original Torah, prophetic of the coming of Christ and the work that was done there.
Great. Thank you.
Sure.
If you never read Sherry's blogs, get on that, because they are some of the best work I've ever seen in exegeting scripture from an analytical perspective.
Do you have a web address for those?
Yeah, I think it's out there at veriyahad.org. It's on the first page.
Teach me to number my days.
Teach me to number my days. We got a link right out there on the front page, so you can click it. Now we're going to take a break for 20 minutes and come back. And so let's be on time at 20 after 12. Let's get back and be ready. And I'll try to too. You guys online, just hang in there if you want for a little while. Go get yourself a peanut butter and beef fat sandwich.
Nice.
And a piece of mincemeat pie. That means you, Norman. We'll be back in 20 minutes. Hello, Norman. You sure are looking good for an old guy. Yeah, he was.
Oh, he was.
There he is, showing his kitchen off. Can't hear you.
Yeah.
Norman, how much does it cost to kick off those calendars? He's stuck in time.
Well, that happened to me a lot last night, and then I lost it.
All right, we're going to